I spent a good chunk of my youth in the rugged wilderness of New Mexico, specifically around the Gila National Forest. My dad was a geologist, and he'd often take me along on his expeditions. We'd spend weeks at a time camping out, exploring the vast expanse of the forest, and studying the rich geological formations. One summer, we were camped out near the Mogollon ghost town, a place that was once a bustling mining town, but now lay abandoned and forgotten. We were there to study some old silver mines that had been closed since the end of Witu. Cell reception was a joke out there, and one evening my dad asked me to drive him up to the top of a nearby hill where he could get a signal. It was just around sunset, and the sky was painted with hues of orange and purple. I drove him up the winding path to the top of the hill, and then walked a little distance away to give him some privacy. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped rapidly, and darkness began to creep in. I started to head back towards the truck, hoping to hurry my dad along. As I neared a cluster of piñon trees, I heard a deep guttural growl. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, deeper and more resonant than a mountain lion. I had left my rifle back at the camp, thinking this was going to be a quick trip. All I had on me was my trusty old Colt .45, which I quickly drew from its holster. I was worried about my dad, who was still on the phone, oblivious to the potential danger. I moved slowly towards him, my gun at the ready, my eyes scanning the growing darkness. As I moved past the cluster of trees, I glanced back over my shoulder to see if my dad had noticed anything. He had, and he was now off the phone, his own pistol in hand. As I turned back, my heart nearly stopped. There, moving quickly towards the cluster of trees, was a massive creature. It was tall, easily over 7 feet, and covered in thick, dark fur. It moved with a speed and agility that belied its size, and I remember thinking that it could easily outrun a deer. My dad didn't see it, his view blocked by the trees and the growing darkness. But I saw it clearly as it crossed the open ground, its massive form illuminated by the last rays of the setting sun. I reached the truck and told my dad, "We need to get out of here." In the days that followed, I replayed that encounter over and over in my mind. I came to believe that there had been another creature, perhaps a juvenile or a female, in the cluster of trees. The growl I'd heard was a warning, and the massive creature I'd seen was rushing to its aid. My Colt .45 is a reliable weapon, but against a creature of that size and speed, I doubt it would have done much good. If it had wanted to harm us, I'm certain it could have done so easily. After that encounter, my dad found a new spot to make his phone calls, one that was much closer to our camp. A few weeks later, he came rushing back to camp, his face pale. He'd heard heavy footsteps behind him and turned to see a large creature running away, up the hill. We stayed in the area for a few more weeks, but I didn't sleep much. Every sound in the night made me jump, and I kept my Colt .45 close at hand. That encounter left a lasting impression on me. It was a stark reminder of the mysteries that still exist in the wild places of the world, and of the respect we must have for the creatures that inhabit them. I realized that this subreddit might be the perfect place to share this peculiar encounter I had back in 2013 in New Mexico. The whole thing unfolded in the surprisingly tranquil town of Clovis, a place I still call home. It's a sweet small town, the kind where everyone knows everyone. It was December 2nd, a couple of days into the holiday season, and the winter chill had laid a beautiful layer of frost over the town. My husband, Dale, had strategically claimed the living room couch as his favorite spot, with our 2 Labradors snuggled at his feet while he read Good Housekeeping and watched some Western on the TV. I was in the kitchen prepping a chili when a sudden instinct urged me to update Dale about the recipe. As I was leaning over to share the sassy secret ingredient that transforms an average chili into an extraordinary one, something peculiar caught my eye. I noticed 2 crimson spots on the top of our living room window blinds. My eyes still focused on Dale, so I could only see the spots from the corner of my eyes. Feeling a tad curious and a bit bewildered, I turned my head to examine the anomalies on the forest green blinds of our window. The 2 spots kept growing bizarrely, merging into 2 substantial, fiery eyes watching me from the other side of the glass. For a moment, time froze, and it was just me and those eyes, gazing at each other. My heart didn't flutter in fear, but, surprisingly, I was in awe. Out of nowhere, this creature, this being, turned its head and retreated from my window. I stayed still, too astounded to react. It's crucial to mention that our window blinds were entirely down, but tilted downwards, meaning anyone outside could get a glimpse of us inside. Of course, we have our humble mobile home elevated 14 high and 70 long in a profoundly rural part of Clovis, on a massive 2-acre property. That spot is now sold, but the memory of that day still lingers. Fast forward, and it was the evening of the A-Day in 2014, and we had a considerable snowfall. With nearly 7 inches the previous day and a couple more overnight, the morning left our surroundings looking like something straight out of a picture book. When I was looking out of our side window, I noticed large tracks close to our house. These tracks were fresh, covered slightly with the fresh snow from the previous night's sprinkle. I decided to take a stroll around the house, which is when I saw the same tracks, only deeper this time, crossing the front yard and leading straight into the woods. Even a bear couldn't have made these tracks. They were too far apart for a 4-legged creature. Intrigued and excited, I decided to take some photographs of these tracks with some references to estimate the size of our visitor. Jump to the July 4th weekend of 2015, when my daughter and I decided to take my girlfriend camping. We chose a spot near Clovis Reservoir, secluded and peaceful. The first night was quiet until we started hearing unusual thuds from behind the tents. It sounded like someone beating a tree with a stick. I had heard similar sounds in audio clips of Bigfoot sightings, which sparked both thrill and a teensy bit of apprehension in me. Soon after this encounter, I even stumbled upon a mention of a sighting, not too far from our area, in an old Google Earth marker. The stories just kept adding up. It's been a few years since these incidents, but the mystery and the intrigue live on. And every time I look back at these memories, a simmering excitement runs through my veins, rekindling my desire to learn more about this enigmatic creature. Fast forward several years, and I still have an audio snippet of an event too strange for words. It happened one fall evening, around the late 70s or early 80s, when I was barely in my teens. Something was rustling and growling in the valley near our old farm in Morris Township. My dad had rushed home to grab a tape recorder. He was keen on documenting these strange noises. When my dad finally got closer, it was too dark to see anything, but the recording clearly captured the strange growls and rustling. Having grown up around those parts, I know these stories might be hard for some to believe. Still, I believe that the mystery of these incidents is what makes them that much more intriguing. Maybe one day soon, we will uncover what lies beyond the ordinary in our very own backyards. I recall this incident from back in the day when I called Socorro, New Mexico home. Picture me back then in the winter of '86, an avid hunter, spending all my free time tracking mule deer or sometimes elk in the Cibolo National Forest that bordered my property. On this one fateful day, the serenity of my lone forest venture took a real nosedive. It was the second day of deer season, and I was well stationed near Bear Mountain. The area provided a sprawling view of the encompassing wilderness, and I had a good spot by this age-old pinyon tree overlooking a valley. The time should have been around 1:30 p.m., when I felt this odd vibe creep into the scene. In all my years of hunting and nocturnal journeys through the woods, never had I sensed something this unsettling. Soon after, a noise like a modulated human voice echoed through the trees. It was more like a distorted radio transmission with notes of Spanish, but in reverse. Then the strangest thing happened. The noise seemed to cover about 400 yards uphill within 20 seconds. With the ground being sloped at about 30 degrees and blanketed in fresh snow, my mind tried to work out the math. That would be over 60 miles per hour. I remember chuckling in disbelief at this hallucination my brain was conjuring. Then the sound of branches snapping struck my ears. Assuming it was deer scampering ahead of these hunters, I prepared myself. Minutes passed, with the solid silence in the woods interrupted only by my racing heart, until something from my peripheral caught my attention. There was an isolated ponderosa pine bucking wildly, appearing as though it was in the middle of a windstorm. Underneath, I saw a creature, about 7 feet tall, which seemed to be the source of disturbance. Its long arm reached upwards, and the massive tree shivered violently at the tug. It moved a few steps, bringing it behind a group of sagebrush. The creature was covered in fur, a shade of deep brown with a lighter streak along its back. But that's all I could make out before it disappeared behind the shrubs. As impossible as it seemed, the thing vanished behind these shrubs that barely reached its waist. I squinted through the crosshairs of my rifle scope. The bush was thin, nothing conspicuous about it, and except for a few trembling leaves, there was no sign of that creature. An overwhelming sensation of dread had spread throughout me, holding me back from investigating further. I felt every warning bell in my head ringing insistently. It was like this inexplicable, gut-wrenching gut suspicion that leaving my spot would be the apex of bad ideas. Still, the smell didn't accompany this ordeal. No musty odor, no nothing. Still can't say what it was. Might have been a figment of my imagination, or perhaps something more real. But isn't that what makes it an adventure? A fascinating tale to share with the family over Thanksgiving. That incident sure took the fun out of hunting for me, and I hung up my boots soon after. It took me years before I tumbled upon this subreddit, and found stories much like my own. I still think back to that day, still wonder what I saw in the afternoon sun of New Mexico, and it still sends a weird shiver through me. Even as I write this, tucked safely as I am in my city apartment, the mysterious allure of that forest feels just as tangible. I got an uncanny story for you from back in the day that to this day still has me scratching my dome. This took place in New Mexico on the first day of elk season in 1992. My dad, his closest pal, and myself were on the Santa Fe National Forest near the vicinity of Coyote Creek State Park. It was an early morning, cold yet not freezing, just the kind of chill where you could see your breath steam up but not feel the bite on your cheeks. We had about a half-foot of fresh snow from the night before, carpeting the forest in pure white. It was a weird weather day. The night was crystal clear, but by morning, a fat fog had rolled in, partnered with a light drizzle that was turning our snow into slush. Our hunting ground was located roughly half a mile down a disused forest road. We found ourselves taking a breather next to a fallen tree before we planned to ascend a hell of a steep incline. That's when we spotted a hefty figure emerging from the cover of some thicket skirting a marshy patch. The figure was dark, almost black against the white snow. Definitely not dressed in standard hunting gear, no fluorescent orange or red like he was asking to get shot, and as far as we could tell, wasn't carrying any equipment. Heck, this figure was navigating through thick ferns and over fallen timber without even a flashlight. That was our first red flag that maybe something bizarre was in play here. This figure tottered about 50 feet away, right on the clear edge of the fog's reach. It cocked its head in our direction, lingered for a second, maybe two, and then went back the same path without a word. At the time, we pegged it as perhaps the daftest hunter we ever came across. But with the recent tales of strange, Bigfoot-like sightings pouring out of New Mexico, it got us wondering. To this day, none of us can shake the gut feeling that what we witnessed was no bear. Fast forward to 1997, on a bone-chilling February morning around 4 a.m., a dude from our neck of the woods was cruising down the old Camino Real when he stumbled across these remarkably large humanoid footprints, crossing the dusty road and veering off into the desert shrubs. I was 18 by then, and when I rolled out of bed later that morning, I found half the neighborhood out investigating these bizarre tracks. Whatever left those footprints, it seemed, had taken a Sunday stroll through our yards, paying particular attention to our rabbit hutches and navigating fences like they were nothing. The weird part was, amidst the exploration, it left behind perfect footprints, impressions almost otherworldly due to their size and distinct shape. The tracks measured around 16 inches in length, 8.5 inches wide, and sunk a good 2 inches into the desert sand. The stride rivaled that of any high-jump athlete, pacing about 4 feet apart. I spent that day obsessively sketching each footprint, probably because I knew nobody would believe this outlandish tale without some proof. To this day, not a soul in or around our neighborhood could make heads or tails out of them, not even our wizened outdoorsmen or seasoned hunters. It could have been a Sasquatch, who knows? Now, fast-forwarding to 2014, I stepped into my backyard, armed with a 1,000,000 candle power spotlight following a recent surge in unusual footprints. The clock read 7:30 p.m. when I fired up that bad boy, illuminating a field about 300 yards downhill. That's when my light caught a red glint, like an animal caught in the headlights. It was a dead stop before darting towards the light at absurd speed. I hightailed it inside, heart pounding like a jackhammer, and brought out my father-in-law. Despite our dual spotlights, we couldn't pick up any trace of the creature. Adrenaline coursing through our veins, we hopped into my truck and drove into the field where I'd first spotted the eye shine. Though we got nothing but the silence of the night, the next day's survey gave us chills. Reeds around the pond stood a good 10 foot tall, and the red gleam was at a guesstimate 7.5 foot. The ground was semi-frozen, with only a single discernible footprint that carried an eerie reminiscence of 92 and 97. Ever since, I've gotten myself a night vision camera, ready to capture whatever the hell it is that seems to enjoy gallivanting around my neighborhood. New Mexico is known for its cryptids, and Lord above knows I've got a story to tell. Is our visitor extraterrestrial, a Sasquatch, or simply an elaborate prankster? Still a mystery. But until that cipher is cracked, sleeping with one eye open ain't that much of a choice. I got an uncanny story for you from back in the day that to this day still has me scratching my dome. This took place in New Mexico on the first day of elk season in 1992. My dad, his closest pal, and myself were on the Santa Fe National Forest near the vicinity of Coyote Creek State Park. It was an early morning, cold yet not freezing. Just the kind of chill where you could see your breath steam up but not feel the bite on your cheeks. We had about a half foot of fresh snow from the night before, carpeting the forest in pure white. It was a weird weather day. The night was crystal clear, but by morning, a fat fog had rolled in, partnered with a light drizzle that was turning our snow into slush. Our hunting ground was located roughly half a mile down a disused forest road. We found ourselves taking a breather next to a fallen tree before we planned to ascend a hell of a steep incline. That's when we spotted a hefty figure emerging from the cover of some thicket skirting a marshy patch. The figure was dark, almost black against the white snow. Definitely not dressed in standard hunting gear, no fluorescent orange or red like he was asking to get shot. And as far as we could tell, wasn't carrying any equipment. Heck, this figure was navigating through thick ferns and over fallen timber without even a flashlight. That was our first red flag that maybe something bizarre was in play here. This figure tottered about 50 feet away, right on the clear edge of the fog's reach. It cocked its head in our direction, lingered for a second, maybe two, and then went back the same path without a word. At the time, we pegged it as perhaps the daftest hunter we ever came across. But with the recent tales of strange Bigfoot-like sightings pouring out of New Mexico, it got us wondering. To this day, none of us can shake the gut feeling that what we witnessed was no bear. Fast forward to 1997, on a bone-chilling February morning around 4 a.m. A dude from our neck of the woods was cruising down the old Camino Real when he stumbled across these remarkably large humanoid footprints crossing the dusty road and veering off into the desert shrubs. I was 18 by then, and when I rolled out of bed later that morning, I found half the neighborhood out investigating these bizarre tracks. Whatever left those footprints, it seemed, had taken a Sunday stroll through our yards, paying particular attention to our rabbit hutches and navigating fences like they were nothing. The weird part was, amidst the exploration, it left behind perfect footprints, impressions almost otherworldly due to their size and distinct shape. The tracks measured around 16 inches in length, 8.5 inches wide, and sunk a good 2 inches into the desert sand. The stride rivaled that of any high-jump athlete, pacing about 4 feet apart. I spent that day obsessively sketching each footprint, probably because I knew nobody would believe this outlandish tale without some proof. To this day, not a soul in or around our neighborhood could make heads or tails out of them. Not even our wizened outdoorsmen or seasoned hunters. It could have been a Sasquatch, who knows. Now, fast-forwarding to 2014, I stepped into my backyard, armed with a 1,000,000 candle-power spotlight following a recent surge in unusual footprints. The clock read 7:30 p.m. when I fired up that bad boy, illuminating a field about 300 yards downhill. That's when my light caught a red glint, like an animal caught in the headlights. It was a dead stop before darting towards the light at absurd speed. I hightailed it inside, heart pounding like a jackhammer, and brought out my father-in-law. Despite our dual spotlights, we couldn't pick up any trace of the creature. Adrenaline coursing through our veins, we hopped into my truck and drove into the field where I'd first spotted the eye shine. Though we got nothing but the silence of the night, the next day's survey gave us chills. Reeds around the pond stood a good 10 foot tall, and the red gleam was at a guesstimate 7.5 foot. The ground was semi-frozen, with only a single discernible footprint that carried an eerie reminiscence of 92 and 97. Ever since, I've gotten myself a night vision camera, ready to capture whatever the hell it is that seems to enjoy gallivanting around my neighborhood. New Mexico is known for its cryptids, and Lord above knows, I've got a story to tell. Is our visitor extraterrestrial, a Sasquatch, or simply an elaborate prankster? Still a mystery. But until that cipher is cracked, sleeping with one eye open ain't that much of a choice. I'm writing about a strange incident that happened to me and my buddy in Ruidoso, New Mexico. We live around the outskirts of this small village and are quite familiar with the terrain and wildlife we encounter in our everyday life. We've heard of mountain lions and even bears being spotted from time to time, but what we witnessed last month was something straight out of a horror flick. It was a usual Friday night and my buddy, let's call him John, and I were out camping near the Bonito Lake, about 10 miles outside of Ruidoso. We've always heard stories about the infamous El Diablo Grande, a mythical creature of the mountains from our local folks, but we never paid much heed. We are both good with guns and have a healthy respect for the wild. We thought nothing could surprise us, but oh boy were we wrong. The campfire was burning low, and we were about to turn in for the night, when we heard an abnormal rustling in the woods nearby. Now we know the sounds of the nocturnal animals, the occasional coyote or raccoon, but this was different. It was much heavier, and it felt closer. The stillness that followed settled a feeling of dread in my stomach better suited to an encounter with a grizzly. Slowly, a large figure emerged from the shadows. It stood on its hind legs like a bear, but was much larger and covered with a dense jet-black fur. The creature effortlessly moved across our campsite, using powerful and silent footfalls. Its eyes glowed in the flickering firelight, showing a spark of intelligence that was almost human. John, who was always the braver of us two, stood his ground, while my heart was pounding in my chest like a runaway horse. There was an overwhelming sense of being watched, of being studied. Suddenly, the creature let out a chilling howl that echoed through the forest, a throaty sound with an eerie musicality, unlike any animal noise I've ever heard. It felt like my blood was turning to ice, and a jolt of electric fear coursed through my veins. The creature stuck around our camp for a few moments more, almost like it was examining us, and then with a swift leap, it ventured back into the dense forest, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. We could hear the rapid thump of its departure, fading away into the distance. In the following weeks, we heard similar stories from other locals. Eerie noises, large footprints, and uncannily smart bear sightings started creating a buzz in our sleepy little town. It was as if El Diablo Grande of the old tales had woken up from a long slumber. Now, I am not a man of superstitions, and it could have been a trick of the night, but what John and I saw that night was not something we can forget or explain away. It was larger than life, literally and figuratively. I've been out in the wild more times than I can count, and I've never seen anything like that. It looked powerful, almost majestic, yet the sense of dread it carried was hard to ignore. So, here I am, a month later, still trying to make sense of it all, and hoping that by sharing my experience, I might find others who've encountered the same creature, or perhaps lure out some explanation from those more knowledgeable. Has anyone else in the Ruidoso area experienced anything similar? Any insights are welcome. It appears to me that the legend of the El Diablo Grande might have more reality to it than we've ever considered. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts. I'd like to share an experience that happened about 20 years ago. This transpired right in the heartland of New Mexico, while I was camping in the Gila wilderness. I'm still trying to make sense of it till this day. Back in '98, my buddies and I were on a multi-day camping trip to Gila. If you didn't know, Gila is New Mexico's gem, a massive expanse of wild lands with breathtaking cliffs and dark, twisted forests. We reached our campsite, which was about half a mile from the Gila Cliff Dwellings National Monument, a historical site covered with ancient Native American cliff dwellings. One evening, after a day of exploration, my friends decided to call it an early night. I, however, had other plans. Back then, I was quite the stargazer. I decided to grab my sleeping bag and head over to the nearby meadow, which has little to no tree cover, perfect for stargazing. Around midnight, the sky was a surreal painting of glowing stars, the kind of beauty only wilderness can offer. Suddenly, I heard a distant hooting from somewhere north of my location. Figuring it was a night owl, I brushed it off and continued admiring the sparkling night. But then I heard it again, a much closer and louder hooting. It had an eeriness to it that made my heartbeat spike. Before I could comprehend, there was this sudden strong stench, like a damp dog smell, only much more intense. I was immediately on high alert, my senses heightened, but I calmed myself down, telling myself these things were normal in the wild. Sometimes, nightmares bloom in the heart of beauty. As I lay still, my peripheral vision caught something moving near the monuments, not too far away. Standing tall, around 8 feet high, was a silhouette that resembled a human, only covered in what seemed like a dense fur coat. The creature moved with an uncanny grace for something of its size. Seeing this brought a cold fear that felt like icy fingers gripping my heart. But within seconds, the figure vanished as swiftly as it appeared. I laid there frozen till the morning sun peaked, its first rays kissing the dew-laden grass. I promptly packed my gear and jogged towards our campsite. My friends laughed off my story, labeling it as a product of a wild imagination fueled by the isolation of the night. In 2005, I happened to talk about this experience with an erudite local, a Native American storyteller around a campfire in Zuni Pueblo. Listening intently to my recount, he shared some tribal lore, tales of enormous, hairy, human-like creatures who were protectors of wilderness and embodiments of nature's fury, whispered through generations of his tribe. His explanation left a queer feeling in me. What I saw that night might not be an overactive imagination or a chance encounter with a bear. Instead, it could be a creature right out of local legends, an ancient protector of the wild New Mexico landscape. I don't know if I will ever truly comprehend whether it was real or just a hoax played by my mind, but the memory of that night in the Gila wilderness is etched deeply in my mind like a vivid painting that refuses to fade. In the hope of throwing some light on my experience, nostalgia pushed me to write to you. Everyone here might keep laughing, but I know what I felt and saw. I'm sure I'm not alone, and your platform might connect me with others who had similar encounters. Until then, I'll hold on to the mystery of that New Mexican night, hoping to get some answers soon. I've debated for a while on whether or not to share my encounter. It happened back in the spring of 2011, but I've chosen now to disclose it. I still find it hard to grapple with what happened, but I believe it should be recorded somewhere. After all, these creatures, whatever they truly are, really do exist, and encounters like mine might serve as pieces to this intricate puzzle. My tale revolves around the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, the southernmost subrange of the Rocky Mountains in northern New Mexico. The region is renowned for its impressive mountain landscapes that encompass forests, meadows, and numerous hiking trails. I often used to go camping in one of my favorite spots tucked away in these mountains. The whole area is abundant in wildlife, and being a nature enthusiast, I used to enjoy the sight of elks, coyotes, and bears from a distance. It was a mid-April day when I decided to go on a solo camping trip in the mountains. I had planned a 3-day stay at my usual camping spot. The weather was just right, not too cold, not too warm, and perfect for a camping adventure. However, as I would soon discover, fate had different plans. The first day went by without a hitch. I enjoyed the beauty of nature and reveled in the calmness that the woods provided. As evening came upon the mountains, I made my dinner by the campfire, a blissful feeling of solitude and serenity washing over me, only tainted slightly by an odd sensation I couldn't quite place, an unsettling sense of being watched. The second day dawned bright and clear. I decided to explore a trail that I hadn't traversed much before. That's when things took a strange twist. I remember distinctly, as the feeling of alertness hit me like a bolt out of the blue while I was hiking. Out of nowhere, nestled in the calmness of the forest, I heard an odd rustling just out of sight. Less than 50 yards away, peering intently from a dense thicket, was this figure. A part of my mind reasoned it to be a hiker, or maybe a hunter, but the longer I observed, the more that theory lost ground. What I saw was too large to be a normal human, standing somewhere around 8 feet tall and covered in dark brown fur. It had long arms that seemed to hang almost to its knees, and possessed a broad-shouldered frame that would make a professional weightlifter look meager. Surprisingly, this creature was eerily still, not moving a muscle. It seemed almost like a life-size statue, but the pair of dark eyes, set under a prominent brow ridge, stared directly at me, completely alive. I didn't notice any obvious facial features in detail, as they were mostly obscured by the creature's long hair or fur. Yet, the piercing gaze had an alertness that held my stare. Suddenly, a loud snap resounded in the air as the creature stepped on a fallen branch, and before I could even absorb what was happening, it turned and disappeared into the woods. The swiftness startled me. For a creature so large, it moved incredibly fast. As the sounds of leaving footfall echoed through the woods, I felt my heartbeat pounding in my ears, a discomfort gnawing at the pit of my stomach. With a chilling sense of realization striking me, I knew this was no ordinary creature. The swiftness, the humanoid qualities, the size, all of it pointed to something I had only heard of in legends and stories. Bigfoot. Yet, confessing to myself made it all the more real and scared me to my bones. For a moment, I was frozen, my mind unsuccessfully trying to rationalize what I had just witnessed. As the reality of the situation finally settled in, my senses began to scream at me to leave. I quickly grabbed my gear and hastily abandoned what was supposed to be a 3-day camping trip, instead reaching the safety of my truck in record time. In all my years of living in New Mexico, and my numerous camping trips in these mountains, I'd never come across anything like this. I've had my run-ins with wildlife, but nothing as bizarre and eerie. This experience, which makes my skin prickle every time I remember it, has changed my whole perspective towards these mythical creatures. After my unnerving encounter, I've not gone back alone, nor have I stayed overnight. My days of solitude in the woods, I'm afraid, have come to a tragic end. Thanks to that one encounter, I now find myself looking over my shoulder with every crackling in the woods, continuously on alert. In case any of you want more specifics or need to ask any questions, feel free to contact me. Also, if you wish to use my story for further research or documentation, I would be more than willing to assist. I hope my story serves as useful material in deciphering the mystery that surrounds these creatures. Best of luck in your research. I grew up in the desolate plains of New Mexico, in a small town detached from the world as we know it. A quiet place, my folks' farm outside Clovis was isolated, miles away from any neighbors. The endless terrain of high mesa and the sleepy town life made my childhood years as tranquil as the gentle breeze that swayed across the farm fields. Yet there was an instance that irrevocably scarred my memories, one that lurks in the underbelly of my subconscious. Spring of 1992, I was a sprightly lad of 13, keen on exploring the vast expanse of wilderness that was my backyard. One evening, as the sun basked the azure skies in shades of soft orange, I took a lone stroll along the fields behind our barn. There, amidst the uniform fields, was an isolated piece of land that was left untouched, a small patch of wilderness, known amongst the townsfolk as the Mesa Redonda, a sizable mound that stood out in the otherwise flat landscape. As I approached the foot of this mound, a strange sensation coursed through my veins. It wasn't fear, no, but an unexpected tingle, akin to suddenly stepping into cold river water on a hot summer day. Reveling in this new sensation, I trudged on, letting my youthful curiosity guide me. Brushing past the unmown weeds and overgrown shrubbery, I climbed atop the Mesa Redonda, soaking in the panoramic view of my modest town that stretched from the foot of this mound to the distant horizon. As I began to head back, right where the slope ended, I saw it. Standing a considerable distance away, there was a figure. What baffled me was what I saw was not a man, but an entity that stood on 2 legs, easily towering over 7 feet, covered in shaggy hair that was a rancid mix of black and silver. It was standing still, and the initial shock of seeing this figure froze me momentarily. However, before I could register more, it turned back and slowly walked off, the rhythm of its lengthy arms swinging in tune with its strides, tattooed forever in my mind. Although I was rattled to my core, I chalked it off as a trick of the setting sun, and summoned enough courage to where I saw the figure. The evidence that lay there, however, made my heart drop. The sandy foothold was etched with large, unfamiliar prints, and there were markings on the low-hanging branches of trees, indicating something massive had recently passed through. Knowing what I saw wasn't a figment of my imagination, but experiencing something I could never fully grasp, I sprinted back home. The next day, baffled by my tale and skeptical of the evidence, my folks passed the incident as a chance encounter with an errant bear. But deep down, engulfed by the disbelief and sheer terror, I knew that what I saw that fateful day was no ordinary creature. Even years later, after moving away and building a life in the city, that day still haunts me. I remember it like it happened yesterday, and the unknown entity, its tall figure, its long arms, still unsettle me. Every time I think of that evening, an icy shiver of the unknown runs down my back, a sense of dread that refuses to sway away. And so, I write this, in an attempt to put my experience into words, hoping to seek solace in the understanding of others who too may have faced the inexplicable fear of the unknown. Or perhaps, gain some answers from my inexplicably hair-raising encounter on that uneventful spring evening in the isolated plains of New Mexico. For now, I remain in my city life, away from the tranquility of the sleepy town of Clovis. Though at times, I do yearn for those simpler days, away from the rat race we so commonly are a part of. Like an ironic twist of fate, it's the uncanny reminder of a beast I once encountered that holds me back. I hope this note finds you well. My name is John, and I have a rather unusual story to share with you that happened back in the fall of 2008. This has haunted me for years, and I feel it's time to share my encounter. I had recently moved to Taos, nestled in the heart of New Mexico, on the high slopes of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The surrounding groves of piñón and juniper trees, with their intoxicating fragrance, were irresistible to a nature lover like me. Often I would go on long hikes near the Kit Carson National Forest, east on US Route 64, especially during cool autumn afternoons. One such afternoon, right around sunset, I picked up my walking stick and decided to hike up to the Devisadero Loop Trail. It was a misty evening, the setting sun casting an eerie glow that formed shadows in the dense clusters of trees. Out here, it was just me, the rustling leaves underfoot, and the occasional braying of elk. The feeling of solitude was an invigorating change from the stress of the city noise. About a half-mile or so into the forest, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned, peering through the thicket of trees. My mind immediately assumed it must have been an elk or a black bear, but as I squinted into the dusk, I felt a different kind of fear beginning to grip me. An electrifying burst of adrenaline washed over me as I realized what I was looking at was no animal I'd ever seen before. This creature was about 8 feet tall, massive, and covered in dark brown hair. Its arms were disproportionately long, and it had a hunched back. The strangest thing, though, was that it was standing on 2 legs, like a man, but much bigger and with the full body hair of an animal. The figure seemed to be curiously overturning rocks and snapping branches off of trees, groaning occasionally as if it communicated with nature itself. Fear seeped into my heart, as I was not prepared for such a moment. Anticipation hung heavy in the air, akin to the seconds before a thunderstorm breaks. I watched the creature a minute longer before my survival instincts forced me into decision. Shaking, I slowly started to back away. Each footfall seemed to echo loudly through the near-silent forest. Gritting my teeth, I managed to find the courage and turned to run. By the time I made it back to the trailhead, night had already begun to settle. My heart was pounding, and my thoughts raced as I started my drive back to town. I was gripped by shock and disbelief, but there was no denying the truth of what I saw that day. The image of that tall, hairy creature, going about its business in the falling dusk, is as vivid today as it was 13 years ago. After that startling experience, I avoided the Devisadero Loop Trail and stuck to well-populated paths when I hiked. The tranquility of Taos still appealed to me, but I was always reminded that the wilderness I loved so much was home to more than just the creatures I was familiar with. I sincerely hope my recounting of this experience gives some insight and adds to the many tales of Bigfoot sightings worldwide. To this day, I am certain what I saw was a living, breathing Bigfoot. It was an encounter that will stay with me forever, leaving me with an uncanny sense of respect for the hidden wonders of the wild. This particular event transpired around 1986 when I was just a young teen. My family had a summer home in the mountains of northern New Mexico near Santa Fe. Our house was an old stone cottage, pretty isolated, but we never felt lonely because there was always the whisper and rustle of the trees, the chirping of a bird, or surprise visits from the woodland creatures. Every day was an adventure for my friends and I. We'd spend hours exploring the dense forest, discovering new paths and hidden canyons. One humid afternoon in mid-August, after a morning filled with chores, I finally set out to explore the Santa Fe National Forest. The sun was blazing hot overhead, and the forest seemed particularly vibrant, thick with the smell of pine needles and damp earth. Our family's dog, Rusty, a big German shepherd, tagged along with me. Rusty was fearless, curiosity brimming in his brown eyes. His excitement at joining me on yet another adventure was contagious. That afternoon, we ventured farther north into the forest than ever before, following a worn-out trail that seemed to have been unused for a long time. We had been walking for an hour when Rusty picked up a scent. His ears pricked up and he bolted off the path, his long legs making quick work of the underbrush. Thinking that Rusty had picked up the trail of a rabbit or a fox, I chased after him, peering through the dense shrubbery. I slowed down only when I reached a sudden clearing. This is where the whole incident takes a turn into bizarre. There in the clearing was Rusty, his tail between his legs, whining and cowering in fear, his gaze fixed upon something or someone. I followed his line of sight and froze in the spot. Not 10 yards from us, there was this massive beast, towering and enormous, with a shine of brown fur. Must have stood at least 8 feet tall and built like a heavyweight champion. It was bipedal and looked like nothing I'd ever seen before. The thing was massive. It could easily dwarf any adult human being. Its face was obscured partially by a cascade of chestnut brown hair. A truly monstrous sight. On seeing it, I felt a wave of adrenaline surge through me, as if I'd plunged into a river of ice-cold water. Scared to my very core, I grabbed Rusty and turned to run back the way I'd come, but I tripped over a gnarled root. I could hear the heavy footfalls of the creature now. The ground seemed to vibrate underneath me. I was too afraid to turn my head and see how close it was. I finally picked myself up and ran faster than ever, back through the underbrush, never looking back, completely terrified of what I'd seen. I reached home, bolted through the door, slammed it shut behind me. My mom, who was cooking up dinner in the kitchen, instantly saw the ghost-white look on my face. On hearing what happened, my parents ensured the house was locked up tight, with my dad keeping watch most of the night. I never ventured deep into the forest after that day, sticking to the periphery where our old stone house was always visible. Over the years, I've had plenty of time to think about the encounter, and I can't help but think, was it a Bigfoot or some other unknown creature? It still sends a jolt of fear up my spine every time I remember the encounter. I don't know if we'll ever find out the truth about these creatures, but one thing's for sure. What I saw that day was definitely not of this world.